The frost on the fields of Sekigahara glints under a weak October sun, a deceptive quiet before the storm. It is dawn on the 21st of October in the year 1600, and 160,000 men stand on the cusp of eternity. Among them, a grizzled general, his face a mask of leather and steel, adjusts his helmet. For 3 decades, he has lived by a code that prizes honor above death, loyalty above all. But in the drifting mist, he sees his lord's banner, and next to it the banner of his enemy. They are one and the same. In the samurai world, where the warrior's path is supposed to be as true as a drawn bowstring, the greatest battles are not fought with swords, but with the soul. This is the story of that conflict, not just of battles won and lost, but of the living heart of the samurai, a heart that would in time be called upon to tear itself apart. If you seek the truth behind the legend, the flesh and blood behind the armor, then walk this path with us. Chapter 1. The Bow and the Bamboo, the Birth of the Warrior. To understand the samurai, you must first forget almost everything you think you know. Forget the stoic philosopher in silent meditation. Forget the unswerving loyalist who would rather carve open his own belly than face shame. In the beginning, there was no code. There was only the land. There was only the sword. Imagine Japan in the closing centuries of the first millennium. The imperial court in Heian-kyo, the city we now call Kyoto, is a world of silk and perfume, of poetry contests and intricate political intrigue. The emperor, a divine figure, sits at the apex of this world, but his power is a ghost. Real influence is wielded by powerful aristocratic families like the Fujiwara, who marry their daughters into the imperial line and rule as regents. It is a society obsessed with beauty, with rank, with the delicate shading of a robe or the precise cutting of a line of verse. It is a world, in short, utterly disconnected from the coarse, brutal reality of the frontiers. And it is on those frontiers, far from the perfumed courts, that our story truly begins. In the northeast, in the wild provinces of Mutsu and Dewa, the Japanese state was slowly, painfully, pushing back the indigenous Emishi people. This was not a war of elegant knights and noble causes. It was a dirty, grinding conflict of ambush and counterambush, fought in dense forests and against howling winter wind. The imperial conscripts, peasant farmers pulled from their fields and handed a spear, were useless in this environment. They were slow, poorly motivated, and terrified. The Emishi, by contrast, were masters of this landscape. They fought on horseback, a blur of motion, firing their bows with devastating accuracy before vanishing back into the trees. The court in Kyoto, desperate for a solution, began to do something that would change Japanese history forever. They stopped relying on conscripts and started empowering local strongmen, wealthy landowners and clan chieftains who already knew how to fight. These men had the resources to buy and train horses. They had been raised with swords in their hand. They had a personal, vested interest in protecting their lands and their people. The court gave them military titles and, more importantly, the freedom to act. In essence, they privatized war. These men were the original bushi, or warrior. The word samurai, which would later come to define them, was not yet in common use. It derived from the verb saburao, meaning to serve, and it referred to the attendants who hovered around the nobility. In these early centuries, the men who would become samurai were not servants. They were masters of their own domain. They were the ones who were served. The key to their rise was not just the sword, but the plow. In the 8th century, the government had instituted reforms that allowed individuals to claim ownership of any new land they successfully cultivated. This was a revolutionary idea. Wealth was no longer simply a matter of imperial appointment. It could be carved out of the wilderness with your own 2 hands, or with the hands of the laborers you could command. Powerful families and Buddhist temples began massive projects of land reclamation, pushing back the frontiers of the wild and turning it into rice paddies, the ultimate source of wealth and power. To avoid the heavy hand of imperial taxation, many of these landowners would donate their lands to powerful nobles or temples in Kyoto, receiving them back as stewards. This created a complex web of public and private landholdings, but the men who actually worked and defended the land remained the same. They were the warriors. By the 10th and 11th centuries, these provincial warrior bands had coalesced into extended family groupings, or clans. The 2 most powerful were the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, and the Tara, or Hike. Both clans were descended from the imperial family itself, princes who had been relegated to commoner status generations earlier. This imperial blood gave them a legitimacy that other local lords lacked, a sense of destiny. They were not just hired muscle, they were aristocracy in their own right, with the pride and ambition that came with it. Life for these early warriors was a harsh education in the practical. A young boy born into a warrior house would receive his first sword before he could barely hold it. He would be taught to ride a horse before he could properly walk. His training was not in philosophy, but in survival. He learned to shoot a bow from a moving saddle, to endure freezing rain without complaint, to look upon a dead body without flinching. The warrior's ethos was a practical one. Protect your lord, expand your clan's lands, and never, ever show weakness. Honor was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible asset. A reputation for ferocity could deter your enemies. A reputation for cowardice would see your lands invaded and your family slaughtered. The rituals of war reflected this practical, personal nature of combat. Before a battle, it was customary for the great warriors on both sides to ride forward and shout out their lineage. They would recite the names of their illustrious ancestors, their deeds, their titles. This was not just bragging. It was a legal and social declaration. It was a way of saying, I am a person of worth. My death or my victory has meaning. It was a challenge, an invitation to single combat. The ideal was for two great champions to face each other, exchange these boasts, and then duel to the death with bow and arrow, a contest of skill and honor that could decide the fate of a larger engagement. But even in these early days, the ideal and the reality were often at odds. The same warrior who would proudly announce his lineage might, in the next breath, order his men to set fire to an enemy's crops or to sneak into his castle under cover of darkness. The goal was victory, not the approval of poets. The way of the warrior was a living, breathing, and often contradictory thing. It was the way of the hunt, the way of the land, the way of survival. It was a code written not in books, but in the scars on a man's body and the loyalty of his retainers. The tensions simmering between these great warrior houses finally boiled over in the mid-12th century, spilling into the elegant corridors of power in Kyoto. The imperial succession, always a tangled web, became a battleground. In 1156, after the death of an emperor, a dispute broke out between his heir and a retired emperor who wished to rule from the shadows. This was the Hojin Rebellion. Both sides called upon the warrior clans for support. For the first time, the Minamoto and the Taira brought their provincial armies into the capital, and the veil of courtly civility was torn away. It was a short, sharp shock, a reminder that the real power in the land no longer resided with those who wrote poetry, but with those who could kill. The Taira, under their ambitious leader Taira no Kiyomori, emerged from the conflict in the ascendant. They skillfully played the game of court politics, marrying into the imperial family, securing high offices, and amassing unprecedented wealth and influence. Kiyomori became the first warrior ever to be appointed to the highest rank in the imperial court, a supreme minister. For a time, it seemed that the Taira had achieved the ultimate dream. They had conquered the court from within. The Minamoto, humiliated and nursing a burning grudge, bided their time. The stage was set for a final, cataclysmic struggle that would redefine the meaning of the warrior and give birth to the samurai as a ruling class. It was a clash not just of armies but of worlds. The refined, cosmopolitan world of the Taira, who had come to love the gilded cage of Kyoto, and the rough, martial world of the Minamoto, who drew their strength from the Kanto Plain, a region of tough warriors and wide horizons. The son of the Minamoto leader had been executed in the aftermath of an earlier uprising. That man's third son, a child named Yoritomo, was spared and exiled. He would grow into manhood in the shadow of his father's death, watching, waiting, dreaming of a day when the bow and the sword would settle the score once and for all. The spark that would engulf Japan in civil war was lit by the ambitions of Taira no Kiyomori himself. In 1180, he performed an act of breathtaking political audacity. He forced the sitting emperor to abdicate and placed his own 2-year-old grandson, Antoku, on the chrysanthemum throne. It was the ultimate power grab, a move that sidelined the imperial lineage in favor of his own blood. For Prince Machihito, the late emperor's son who had been passed over, it was an unforgivable insult. He issued a call to arms, a secret appeal to the Minamoto and other disaffected warrior houses across the land, urging them to rise up against the Terra tyranny. The call reached Minamoto no Yoritomo in his exile in Izu province. Now a man in his early 30s, Yoritomo was not the fiery, impetuous warrior of legend. He was calculating, patient, and ruthlessly intelligent. He saw in Machihido's plea not a romantic quest to restore a prince, but a practical opportunity to destroy his family's enemy. He raised his standard, and warriors from the Kanto, the Minamoto heartland, flocked to him. They were not coming for the emperor. They were coming for a chance at land, at reward, at glory under a leader they understood. Yoritomo promised them just that. He promised them that if they followed him, their service would be recognized and rewarded. This was the foundation of a new kind of loyalty, a feudal contract written in blood and rice. The war that followed, the Genpei War, was a brutal, sprawling conflict that raged across Japan for 5 years. It was a war of mountain passes and naval battles, of famous duels and shocking betrayals. It gave birth to the enduring legends of the samurai. We see Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's brilliant and tragic younger brother, leading a small force up a treacherous cliff path at the Battle of Ikinotani, taking the Terra army completely by surprise. We feel the spray of the sea at the final naval battle of Dan no Yura, where the currents themselves seem to turn against the Terra, and the young Emperor Antoku, his grandmother weeping, is taken in her arms and leaps into the dark water to drown rather than be captured. It is in the crucible of this war that the samurai ethos, still unwritten, began to take on a more defined shape. It was an ethos defined by the relationship between a lord and his retainer. A man who swore fealty to Yoritomo became a gokunin, a houseman of the shogun. He was granted land and the right to administer it, and in return, he owed military service and absolute loyalty. This was the bond, a personal, reciprocal, and sacred pact. To break it was to be shamed before the gods and before men. This was the core of the samurai way, a fierce, unwavering devotion to one's lord, a devotion that superseded even family ties. Yet even as this ideal was being forged, its fragility was also on display. The war ended in 1185 with the total annihilation of the Terra clan, but the victor, Yoritomo, was consumed by a paranoid fear of the very loyalty he demanded. His brother, Yoshitsune, the military genius who had won the war for him, became the object of his suspicion. Yoritomo turned on him, hounding him across the country until Yoshitsune was forced to take his own life. The message was clear. Loyalty was a one-way street. It flowed upward from retainer to lord. The lord owed his men protection and reward, but he was not bound by the same rules of personal affection. It was a brutal lesson, one that would echo through the centuries. Having destroyed his enemies and eliminated his rivals, Yoritomo did something unprecedented. He did not try to abolish the imperial court in Kyoto. He simply built a rival government, a military government, right next to it. He established his headquarters in the small eastern town of Kamakura, far from the decadent influence of the capital. In 1192, the emperor granted him the title that would define Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries, Sei Taishogun, or barbarian subduing generalissimo. He was the shogun, the dictator of Japan, and his rule was the rule of the samurai. For the first time, the warrior class was not just a tool of the court. They were the court. The samurai had become the rulers of Japan, but the peace that Yoritomo forged was not to last. The system he built, based on personal loyalty to his own family, the Minamoto, proved fragile. When the Minamoto line died out within a few generations, power passed to the Hojo family, who ruled as regents for a series of figurehead shoguns. The locus of power remained in Kamakura, but the personal bond between the shogun and his gokunin weakened. Warriors across the country were left to manage their own lands, their loyalties divided between distant Kamakura and their local lords. It was in this atmosphere of simmering tension that the greatest external threat in Japanese history appeared on the horizon. In 1274, Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who had already conquered China, sent a fleet and an army to invade Japan. The samurai of Kyushu, the closest to the threat, prepared to meet them in the traditional way. They expected a series of formal challenges, of single combats between champions. What they got was something else entirely. The Mongol army was a terrifying alien thing. They fought in disciplined formations, using explosive gunpowder grenades and massed volleys of poisoned arrows. Their tactics were not about individual honor, but about killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. The samurai, riding out to announce their lineage, were simply cut down by the thousand. It was a cultural and military shock from which the old ways would never fully recover. Only a providential typhoon, which the Japanese called the kamikaze, or divine wind, smashed the Mongol fleet and saved the country from conquest. The victory, however, was a poisoned gift. The kamikaze had saved Japan, but the samurai who fought and died on the beaches of Kyushu felt cheated. They had risked everything, and there was no plunder to be had from a sunken fleet. The Hojo regents in Kamakura had no new lands to give them as reward. The old feudal contract, the bond of loyalty for reward, was broken. Discontent spread through the warrior class like a disease. The divine wind had repelled the foreign enemy, but it had also blown away the last vestiges of stability. The Kamakura shogunate, for all its military origins, had built its legitimacy on its ability to administer justice and reward its loyal retainers. The Mongol invasions shattered that foundation. The warriors who had bled on the beaches of Hakata Bay, who had stormed Mongol ships in desperate nighttime raids, returned home not with glory, but with empty hands. The shogunate had no land to give them. The enemy had come from across the sea and retreated back into it, leaving no estates to confiscate, no farms to distribute as reward. For the first time in the history of the samurai, the fundamental contract of the warrior class, service rendered in exchange for reward, had been broken, not through betrayal, but through the very nature of the victory itself. The discontent festered for decades. The Hojo regents who ruled in Kamakura tried to maintain order through an increasingly elaborate legal code, the Gosabai Shikimoku of 1232, which codified samurai customs and attempted to provide a framework for resolving disputes over land and inheritance. But a legal code could not fill empty stomachs or soothe wounded pride. The great warrior houses of the West, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, grew sullen and resentful. They watched as the Hojo in Kamakura grew ever more powerful, ever more entrenched, while they themselves struggled to make ends meet. The loyalty that had been the bedrock of the samurai system began to corrode, replaced by a cold, calculating pragmatism. The imperial court in Kyoto, ever watchful for an opportunity to reclaim its lost authority, sensed the weakness. In 1318, a new emperor ascended the throne, Go-Daigo. He was not content to be a mere figurehead, a puppet dancing on the shogunate's strings. He was ambitious, intelligent, and burning with the desire to restore direct imperial rule. For years, he worked in secret, plotting with disaffected warriors and powerful Buddhist temples, waiting for the moment to strike. The moment came in 1331. Go-Daigo raised an army and declared the shogunate illegitimate. The resulting conflict, known as the Genko War, was a chaotic and brutal affair that dragged on for 2 years. At first, the shogunate's forces, still the most powerful military machine in Japan, seemed to have the upper hand. Go-Daigo was captured and exiled, but the fire of rebellion had been lit, and it spread faster than anyone could have predicted. The emperor's cause became a rallying point for all those who had grievances against the Hojo, the Western warriors who had never been rewarded, the local strongmen who resented Kamakura's interference, the ambitious generals who saw a chance for advancement. Among those who answered the call was a warrior of relatively modest birth but immense strategic genius, Kusunoki Masashide. Masashide was not a great lord with vast estates. He was a local leader from the province of Kawachi, near the imperial capital, but he possessed a quality that would become central to the samurai legend: absolute, unwavering loyalty. He pledged himself to Go-Daigo's cause, and proceeded to wage a brilliant guerrilla campaign against the shogunate's armies, holding out in his mountain fortress of Akasaka long after any reasonable commander would have surrendered. His devotion to the emperor, his willingness to fight against impossible odds for a cause he believed in, became the template for a new kind of samurai ideal, one where loyalty was not a contract between lord and retainer, but a spiritual bond between a warrior and a sacred cause. The decisive blow against the Kamakura shogunate, however, came not from Masashide's guerrillas, but from within its own ranks. Ashikaga Takoji was a general of the powerful Ashikaga clan, themselves descended from the Minamoto line. The shogunate sent him to crush the imperial rebellion, but Takoji had his own ambition. Perhaps he saw which way the wind was blowing. Perhaps he simply believed that the Hojo's time had passed. In 1333, while marching west with a massive army, he made a fateful decision. He turned his forces around, marched on Kamakura itself, and sacked the city. The Hojo regents, their 3-century rule at an end, committed suicide in their family temple as the flames consumed their capital. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph. The emperor was back, and for a brief shining moment, it seemed that the old order might be restored. This was the Kemu Restoration, a noble experiment in returning power to the imperial court. Go-Daigo set about dismantling the shogunate's institutions, reclaiming lands and appointing his own loyalists to positions of authority. But the emperor, for all his intelligence, made a fatal error. He failed to understand that Japan had changed. The country was now run by samurai. For samurai, you could not simply wish away a century of warrior rule and return to the elegant inefficiencies of the Heian court. Go-Daigo rewarded his samurai supporters poorly, favoring court nobles and Buddhist priests for the most important posts. He treated men like Ashikaga Takoji, without whom he would never have regained the throne, with suspicion and ingratitude. It was a profound miscalculation. The samurai had not fought to restore the emperor so that they could go back to being ignored provincials. They had fought for land, for status, for recognition. And when that recognition was denied, they looked for a new leader. That leader was Ashikaga Takoji. In 1335, using the pretext of a minor uprising, Takoji requested the title of shogun. Go-Daigo refused. Takoji, with the cold logic of a samurai who had seen too much to believe in imperial fairy tales, simply took it anyway. He raised his banner and the warriors of Japan flocked to him, not out of loyalty to the Ashikaga name, but because Takoji promised them what Go-Daigo would not: a government run by warriors for warriors. Go-Daigo, refusing to accept defeat, fled south to the Yoshino Mountains, where he established a rival court. Takoji, in Kyoto, installed a different emperor from a different branch of the imperial family and had himself formally appointed shogun in 1338. Japan now had 2 emperors and 2 courts: the northern court in Kyoto, backed by the Ashikaga shogunate, and the southern court in Yoshino, clinging to the dream of imperial rule. This period, known as the Nanbokucho, or Northern and Southern Courts period, would last for nearly 60 years, a bloody and confusing era of constant warfare that blurred the lines of loyalty beyond recognition. For the samurai, this was a time of impossible choices. Whose emperor was the real emperor? Which side had the mandate of heaven? Families split, brothers fought brothers, and the old certainties dissolved into a fog of shifting allegiances and strategic betrayals. Kusunoki Masashide, the paragon of loyalty, died fighting for the southern court in a desperate final battle, a martyr to a cause that was already lost. His death and the unwavering devotion it represented would be remembered and romanticized for centuries. But in its own time, it was just another tragedy in an endless war. By 1392, the third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, finally brokered a peace. The southern court surrendered, and the imperial line was reunited under the northern court's emperor. But the victory was hollow. The Ashikaga shoguns, who ruled from their headquarters in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, were never able to command the same authority as the Hojo in Kamakura. They were first among equals, powerful lords whose power depended on their ability to manage a fractious coalition of semi-independent regional warlords, the daimyo. The stage was now set for the most turbulent and transformative period in samurai history. The Onin War, a succession dispute that erupted in 1467, would tear the delicate fabric of Ashikaga authority to shreds and plunge Japan into a century of relentless civil war. It was a time when the old rules would be not just broken, but ground into dust, and a new kind of warrior would emerge, ruthless, pragmatic, and utterly alone. Chapter 2: The Unwritten Way, Loyalty, Blood, and the Shogun's Peace. The century that followed the Onin War has no equal in Japanese history. It is called the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, a name that conjures images of endless conflict, of castles burning on distant hills, of ambitious men carving kingdoms from the chaos with nothing but their wits and their swords. It was an age when the samurai code, still unwritten and unspoken, was tested to its absolute limits. bent into new shapes by the brutal demands of survival. To understand the Sengoku samurai, you must first understand the world they inhabited. The old certainties were gone. The shogun in Kyoto was a ghost, a political fiction with no army, no money, and no authority. The emperor was a shadow, hidden away in his palace, performing ancient rituals for a court that could barely afford to keep its roofs from leaking. Real power lay in the provinces, with the daimyo, the great names, who ruled their domains as independent warlords. These daimyo were not the refined courtiers of earlier ages. They were hard men, forged in the fires of constant warfare. A daimyo's primary job was survival. Survival against rival lords, survival against rebellious retainers, survival against the ever-present threat of famine, disease, and betrayal. To survive, he needed three things: land, warriors, and a castle. The land was the foundation. Rice was wealth, and wealth was power. A daimyo who could irrigate new paddies, who could attract farmers to his domain with the promise of protection and fair treatment, who could efficiently tax the harvest and store the surplus against times of need. That daimyo would have the resources to feed his samurai, to equip them with good horses and sharp swords, to build walls and dig moats. Land management was not a job for clerks. It was a military necessity. The warriors were the instruments of that power. They were the daimyo's retainers, his vassals, his samurai. But the relationship between a Sengoku daimyo and his men was far more complex and volatile than the old feudal bond of the Kamakura period. A daimyo could not simply command loyalty. He had to earn it, buy it, and constantly reinforce it. His retainers were ambitious men in their own right, with their own lands, their own followers, their own dreams of power. They served the daimyo because it served their interests, because he could reward them with new land, because his reputation gave them protection, because the alternative was to be swallowed up by a more powerful neighbor. This was the age of Gekkokujo, those below overthrowing those above. The phrase captures the essence of the Sengoku period. It was a time when a peasant could become a samurai could become a lord, and a lord could become a shogun if he had the talent, the luck, and the ruthlessness to seize the opportunity. Social mobility, unheard of in earlier eras, became a fact of life. The great unifiers of the late Sengoku period, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu, all rose from relatively humble beginnings through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer force of will. In this chaotic world, the samurai code was not a set of abstract principles to be studied and admired. It was a living, breathing reality, tested every day in the most practical of ways. A samurai's honor was his most valuable asset. A reputation for courage and loyalty could attract powerful patrons. A reputation for treachery or cowardice could get a man killed, and his family with him. But the path of honor was not always straight. A samurai might be forced to choose between loyalty to his lord and loyalty to his own family. He might be ordered to do something shameful or be asked to betray a friend. In the Sengoku period, these choices were not hypothetical. They were the daily bread of the warrior class. Consider the life of a typical Sengoku samurai. He rises before dawn in his lord's castle town, a bustling community of warriors, merchants, and artisans clustered at the foot of the fortress walls. He checks his equipment, his sword, his bow, his armor, stored carefully in lacquered chests to protect them from the humid Japanese air. He drills with his comrades, practicing formation, perfecting their coordination with the new and terrifying weapons that are beginning to appear on Japanese battlefields. Those weapons were, of course, the Portuguese arquebuses. In 1543, a Chinese ship carrying Portuguese traders was blown off course and landed on the island of Tanegashima, off the southern coast of Kyushu. The local lord was fascinated by the long, heavy tubes the foreigners carried, tubes that could spit fire and lead with a thunderous roar, killing a man at a distance no arrow could match. He bought 2 of them and set his swordsmiths to the task of copying them. Within a few years, Japanese smiths had not only mastered the technology but improved upon it, producing firearms that were more accurate and more reliable than their European originals. The introduction of the gun changed everything. The old ways of samurai warfare, the formal challenges, the single combats, the glorious charges of mounted archers, became obsolete overnight. A peasant with a week's training could kill the greatest swordsman in Japan from 100 paces away. Armor that had been designed to turn arrows had to be completely redesigned to stop bullets. Castle walls that had stood for centuries were suddenly vulnerable to cannon fire. The daimyo who adapted fastest thrived. Oda Nobunaga, the first of the great unifiers, understood the potential of firearms better than anyone. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed 3,000 arquebusiers behind wooden palisades, rotating them in disciplined volleys to pour a continuous hail of lead into the massed cavalry charges of the Taikta clan, the most feared warriors of their generation. The Taikta samurai, the elite of the elite, were cut down in their hundreds, their glorious charges shattered against the cold, mechanical efficiency of massed gunfire. It was a massacre, a moment that signaled the end of an era. And yet, even as the gun transformed warfare, the old values persisted. The samurai who fell at Nagashino did not die less bravely because they were shot rather than cut down. The Taikta cavalry who charged again and again into the face of certain death were not less loyal because their loyalty was wasted. The code, the unwritten way, was not about tactics or technology. It was about the spirit in which a man faced his fate. And in that, the Sengoku samurai remained as fierce as their ancestors. Oda Nobunaga was a man who seemed to embody the contradictions of the Sengoku age. He was ruthless, ambitious, and utterly without sentiment, a cold-eyed strategist who burned temples, slaughtered monks, and destroyed anyone who stood in his path. He was also a patron of the arts, a lover of European culture, and a visionary who dreamed of a unified Japan under a single, unquestioned authority. His emblem was a golden demon, and he lived up to it. By 1582, Nobunaga had crushed his enemies, broken the power of the warrior monks, and reduced the great daimyo of central Japan to vassals. He controlled half the country and was preparing to launch a final campaign to bring the West under his heel. His general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was deep in enemy territory, besieging a fortress. Nobunaga, with a small retinue, stopped at the Hanoji Temple in Kyoto on his way to join the campaign. It was a moment of rare leisure, a pause in the relentless march of conquest. He never left the temple. One of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, suddenly turned on his lord. His army surrounded Hanoji and set it ablaze. Nobunaga, trapped inside with only a handful of retainers, fought desperately but was overwhelmed. Rather than be captured, he committed seppuku in the flames. His body was never found, adding to the dark legend of his end. Mitsuhide's motives remain a mystery to this day. Was it personal ambition, a grudge, a desperate bid for survival? The historical record offers tantalizing clues but no definitive answer. What is certain is that his betrayal sent shockwaves through Japan. Loyalty, always a fragile commodity in the Sengoku world, had been shattered in the most spectacular way imaginable. If a man like Nobunaga, the most powerful lord in Japan, could be murdered by his own trusted general, then no one was safe. But the story of Hanoji is not just a story of betrayal. It is also a story of loyalty, a loyalty so fierce, so instantaneous, that it changed the course of history. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's greatest general, was pinned down hundreds of miles away, facing a powerful enemy army. When the news of Nobunaga's death reached him, he made an impossible choice. He negotiated a secret truce with his enemy, a truce so favorable to the other side that it could only mean one thing: something catastrophic had happened. Within days, Hideyoshi had marched his army at incredible speed back to Kyoto. Mitsuhide, expecting to consolidate his power, was caught completely off guard. At the Battle of Yamazaki, just 11 days after Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi's forces crushed Mitsuhide's army. The traitor was killed by peasant bandits as he fled the battlefield. Hideyoshi's lightning response was not just military genius. It was an act of profound loyalty. He had no obligation to avenge Nobunaga. He was a general, not a son, not an heir. He could have claimed Nobunaga's domains for himself or carved out his own kingdom. Instead, he chose to honor his dead lord, to destroy the man who had betrayed him. That choice, more than any battle he ever won, established his legitimacy. He became the avenger of Oda Nobunaga, the keeper of the flame. Over the next decade, Toyotomi Hideyoshi completed Nobunaga's work. He conquered Shikoku, Kyushu, and the great Hojo domain in the Kanto. By 1590, Japan was unified for the first time in over a century. Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant farmer, had become the ruler of all Japan. Hideyoshi's rise was the ultimate example of Gekkokujo, the world turned upside down. He was short, ugly, and unassuming, nicknamed Saru or Monkey by those who underestimated, but he possessed a genius for politics, a warmth and charisma that Nobunaga lacked, and an unerring ability to read men and manipulate their ambition. He understood that the Sengoku samurai, after a century of constant war, were exhausted. They wanted peace. They wanted stability. They wanted to enjoy the lands they had won, without constantly looking over their shoulders for the next attack. Hideyoshi gave them that peace, but at a price. He froze the social order in place, decreeing that only samurai could bear swords. Farmers were to farm, warriors were to fight, and never the twain shall meet. He conducted a sword hunt, collecting weapons from peasants and temples, ensuring that the warrior class would have a monopoly on violence. He also began the monumental task of surveying the entire country, measuring rice production, and assigning every samurai a fixed stipend based on the productivity of the land they administered. The fluid, chaotic world of the Sengoku was being solidified into a rigid hierarchy, but peace for a samurai was a strange and uncomfortable condition. What did a warrior do when there were no wars to fight? How did he prove his worth when there were no enemies to kill? The old skills, honed over generations, began to atrophy. The values of courage, loyalty, and honor, which had been tested every day on the battlefield, became abstract concepts, debated and discussed but no longer lived. The samurai were becoming something new, a hereditary class of warriors who had never fought a war. Hideyoshi, in his final years, grew paranoid and unstable. He launched a disastrous invasion of Korea, a fantastical dream of conquering China that ended in stalemate and the deaths of tens of thousands of Japanese and Korean soldiers. He fathered a son, Hideyori, in his old age, and desperately tried to secure the succession. On his deathbed in 1598, he appointed a council of the 5 most powerful daimyo to rule as regents until his son came of age. The head of that council was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the lord of the Kanto Plain, a patient and cunning warrior who had waited his entire life for an opportunity like this. The stage was set for one final, decisive conflict. The great lords of Japan gathered their armies, sharpened their swords, and chose their sides. The question that had haunted the samurai for 1,000 years, what is loyalty and to whom is it owed, would be answered not in poetry but in blood on a foggy plain called Sekigahara. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought on October 21, 1600, was the largest and most important battle in samurai history. It was not a battle of good versus evil, or of loyalty versus betrayal. It was a battle of coalition, of shifting alliances, of men who had spent their entire lives navigating the treacherous waters of Sengoku politics, and were now forced to make a final, irrevocable choice. On one side stood the Western Army, loyal to the boy Hideyori and his mother, led by the charismatic but indecisive Ishida Mitsunari. On the other side stood the Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu. The forces were roughly equal, 80,000 men on each side. The battle would be decided not by numbers, but by the loyalty, or lack thereof, of a handful of key commanders. As the sun rose over the valley, the two armies deployed in the thick fog. The tension was unbearable. Men checked their weapons, whispered prayers to their patron gods, and stared into the mist, waiting for the moment when the killing would begin. The battle opened with a chaotic exchange of arquebus fire, the crackling of guns echoing off the mountainsides. Then, the armies closed, and the real slaughter began. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. The Western Army, fighting on the defensive, held its positions against wave after wave of Eastern attacks. The Kobyakawa clan, a large contingent of the Western Army, had been placed on a mountain overlooking the battlefield where they sat on their hands, refusing to engage. They were the key to the battle, and everyone knew it. Ieyasu, watching from his command post, had spent months before the battle secretly negotiating with Kobyakawa Hidaki, promising him vast rewards if he would switch sides at the critical moment. Now, that moment had arrived. Ieyasu ordered his arquebusiers to fire a volley directly at Kobyakawa's position, a signal, a reminder, a threat. For long, agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, with a great shout, the Kobyakawa samurai surged down the mountainside and crashed into the flank of the Western Army. It was the signal for a cascade of betrayal. One after another, Western commanders turned their coats, falling upon their former allies with savage fury. The Western army, caught between the Eastern forces and their own treacherous comrades, dissolved into a rout. Ishida Mitsunari fled the battlefield in disguise, only to be captured and executed a few days later. Sekigahara was not a battle, it was a verdict. In a single day, Tokugawa Ieyasu had eliminated his rivals and established his unquestioned supremacy. Within 3 years, he would formally receive the title of shogun from the emperor, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for more than 250 years. The Sengoku period was over. The age of peace had begun. But the peace came at a profound cost. The samurai who had fought at Sekigahara, who had spent their lives in the saddle, who had built their identities on courage and martial prowess, now found themselves obsolete. The Tokugawa shogunate, determined to prevent another century of chaos, imposed a rigid social order designed to freeze Japan in time. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a figurehead. The shogun ruled from Edo, the small fishing village that Ieyasu had transformed into a vast capital city. The daimyo were carefully controlled, forced to spend every other year in Edo, leaving their families there as hostages when they returned to their domain. And the samurai, the warrior class, became bureaucrats. They were still permitted to wear their 2 swords, the daisho, as a symbol of their status. They still received their stipends of rice. They still studied the martial arts, practiced their swordsmanship, and recited the tales of their ancestors' glorious deeds. But they had no wars to fight. Their swords grew dull from disuse. Their armor gathered dust in storehouses. They became, in effect, a hereditary class of civil servants, administering the domains of their lords, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and maintaining order in a society that had no use for their primary skill. This was the great paradox of the Tokugawa peace. The samurai had finally achieved what their ancestors had dreamed of, a unified Japan, ruled by a shogun with no more wars. But in achieving that dream, they had rendered themselves unnecessary. The code of the warrior, the unwritten way that had been forged in blood and tested in countless battles, had to be reinvented for a world without war. It had to become a code of ethics, a philosophy, a way of life, rather than a practical guide to survival on the battlefield. This transformation was not easy. For many samurai, the peace was a kind of death. They felt their skills atrophying, their purpose fading. Some turned to scholarship, studying Confucian texts and writing treatises on the proper conduct of the warrior. Others turned to the arts, composing poetry, practicing the tea ceremony, or cultivating gardens. The fierce, pragmatic warriors of the Sengoku period were gradually replaced by a new kind of samurai, refined, educated, and utterly removed from the realities of combat. But beneath the surface of peace, the old tension simmered. The loyalty that had bound a samurai to his lord was still expected. But what did it mean when there were no battles to fight? The honor that had been proven in combat had to be proven in other ways, through impeccable behavior, through scrupulous honesty, through a willingness to die rather than suffer shame. The code was becoming formalized, written down, turned into a system of ethics that could be taught and studied. It was becoming, in short, the Bushidō that the world would come to know. The Tokugawa shogunate, ever watchful for threats, also turned its attention outward. The Portuguese and Spanish missionaries who had arrived with the arquebuses were now seen as a danger, a potential fifth column that could undermine the shogun's authority. Ieyasu's son and grandson, the second and third Tokugawa shogun, grew increasingly hostile to Christianity. They expelled the missionaries, executed Japanese converts, and finally, in the 1630s, closed Japan to the outside world. For more than 2 centuries, Japan would be a secret empire, isolated from the West, frozen in time. The samurai, trapped in this gilded cage, began to dream of the past. They romanticized the Sengoku period, the age of their grandfathers, when a man could prove his worth with a sword. They told stories of legendary warriors, of great battles, of impossible loyalties. And in 1703, a group of samurai from the small domain of Akko would give them a story so powerful, so perfect, that it would define the samurai code for all time. Chapter 3. The Age of Warring States, the Dream of the Sword. To understand the 47 Ronin, you must first understand what a Ronin was. The word literally means wave man, a person adrift, like a wave on the ocean with no lord to anchor him. In the Tokugawa period, Ronin were a problem. They were samurai who, for one reason or another, had lost their masters, perhaps through war, perhaps through scandal, perhaps through the simple extinction of a daimyo line. They wandered the country, selling their swords as mercenaries, teaching martial arts, or simply living as bandits. They were a reminder that the samurai class, for all its pretensions, was not immune to the vagaries of fortune. The story begins in 1701, in the corridors of power in Edo. Two daimyo had been assigned to entertain imperial envoys from Kyoto, a task requiring exquisite knowledge of court etiquette. One of them was Asano Naganori, the young lord of Akko, a small but prosperous domain. The other was Kame Korchika. To guide them through the complex rituals, the shogunate assigned a high-ranking official named Kira Yashinaka, a master of protocol. Kira was a man of immense pride and petty cruelty. He expected lavish gifts in return for his instruction. Asano, a sincere and somewhat naive young man, offered only the customary presents. Kira, insulted, began to humiliate Asano publicly, sneering at his manners, mocking his efforts, and whispering poisonous comments to the other officials. He also tormented Kame, who, unlike Asano, responded by plotting to kill Kira on the spot. Kira, getting wind of this, began to treat Kame with exaggerated courtesy while redoubling his attacks on the more vulnerable Asano. The pressure built for weeks. Asano endured the insults with the stoicism expected of a samurai, but inside he was seething. Finally, on the day the envoys were to be received, Kira delivered one insult too many. In the great corridor of Edo Castle, in full view of the assembled dignitaries, Asano snapped. He drew his short sword and attacked Kira, wounding him in the face before guards could pull him away. Drawing a sword inside the castle was a capital crime. It was an act of supreme disrespect to the shogun, whose presence sanctified the entire compound. Asano was placed under house arrest and ordered to commit seppuku by sunset that very day. He died as a samurai should, composing a death poem and slicing open his belly. His domain of Akko was confiscated. His samurai became Ronin. Kira, though wounded, survived, and in the eyes of samurai morality, that was the real injustice. Asano had been provoked, tormented, driven to a desperate act. Kira, the instigator, the petty tyrant who had abused his authority, walked away unscathed. The shogunate's decision, legally correct, felt morally wrong. Among Asano's retainers, a cold fury began to build. The retainers, led by a senior counselor named Oishi Kuranosuke, faced an impossible choice. They could accept their fate, disperse, and find new lords. That was the rational, practical path. Or they could avenge their lord, killing Kira Yashinaka, and in doing so almost certainly die themselves. The law was clear. Private vengeance was forbidden. Anyone who killed another in a blood feud would be punished by death. For a samurai, however, the law was not the only consideration. There was also the code, the unwritten, deeply felt obligation to one's lord. A samurai who failed to avenge his master was a coward unworthy of the name. His ancestors would be ashamed. His descendants would bear the stain forever. The retainers of Akko debated for months, agonizing over the choice. Some left, deciding that loyalty to their own families outweighed loyalty to a dead lord. Others, led by Oishi, began to plot in secret. The plot required absolute secrecy and perfect deception. Oishi and his fellow conspirators knew that Kira, expecting revenge, would be on his guard. They had to lull him into complacency. So Oishi embarked on an elaborate act of self-destruction. He moved to Kyoto, abandoned his family, and plunged into a life of debauchery. He frequented brothels and tea-houses, drank himself insensible, and brawled in the streets. Kira's spies, watching his every move, reported that the Ronin of Akko were leaderless, broken, and no threat. But while Oishi played the fool in Kyoto, the conspiracy grew. Other Ronin, scattered across the country, waited for his signal. They sold their possessions, said goodbye to their families, and prepared to die. In late 1702, after nearly 2 years of patient deception, the signal came. The Ronin gathered secretly in Edo. On the night of December 14, 1702, as a cold wind swept through the city and snow began to fall, 47 Ronin launched their attack. They divided into 2 groups and stormed Kira's mansion from front and back. The guards, taken completely by surprise, fought desperately but were quickly overwhelmed. Kira himself hid in a charcoal shed, trembling with fear. The Ronin found him, dragged him out, and offered him the chance to die as a samurai to commit seppuku. He refused, unable or unwilling to take his own life. So Oishi, with his own short sword, cut off Kira's head. The Ronin then marched through the dark streets of Edo to the temple where their lord was buried. They carried Kira's head on a lance, along with a written statement explaining their actions. They washed Asano's tombstone, offered the head as a sacrifice, and reported their deed to his spirit. Then, they waited for the authorities to come. The nation was electrified. The story of the 47 Ronin spread like wildfire, passed from mouth to mouth, celebrated in ballads and plays. The Ronin had done exactly what the samurai code demanded, exactly what every warrior secretly dreamed of doing. They had sacrificed everything for loyalty. They had chosen honor over life. The shogunate faced a dilemma. If they pardoned the Ronin, they would be condoning private vengeance, undermining their own authority. If they executed them, they would be punishing men for embodying the highest ideals of the samurai class. After months of debate, they reached a Solomonic compromise. The Ronin would be allowed to die as samurai, by their own hand, rather than being executed as common criminals. On the 4th of February 1703, all 46 surviving Ronin, one had died during the attack, committed seppuku. They were buried in the same temple as their lord, their graves a pilgrimage site that remains to this day. The story of the 47 Ronin became the definitive statement of samurai loyalty. It was told and retold, embellished and romanticized, until it became a kind of secular scripture. The Ronin had shown that the old values, the values of the Sengoku period, still lived in the hearts of the samurai, even in an age of peace and bureaucracy. They had shown that honor was not just a word, but a thing worth dying for. But the story also reveals the deep tensions within Tokugawa society. The shogunate, for all its power, could not simply command the loyalty of its subjects. It had to compete with an older, more visceral loyalty, the loyalty of a retainer to his lord. The Ronin's act was a challenge to the state's monopoly on violence, a reminder that the samurai code was not something the shogun could control. In the end, the shogunate had to honor that code, allowing the Ronin to die as heroes rather than criminals. The Tokugawa peace continued, unbroken. The samurai remained bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars. But beneath the surface of order, the ghost of the warrior past haunted every man who wore two swords. They dreamed of Sekigahara, of Nagashino, of the great battles their ancestors had fought. They studied the martial arts, perfecting techniques they would never use in real combat. They wrote treatises on strategy and ethics, trying to distill the essence of the warrior's way. And as the decades passed and the peace stretched into centuries, the dream of the sword became more powerful, more romantic, and more dangerous. The samurai had become a class of warriors who had never fought a war. And when, in the middle of the 19th century, the outside world came crashing in, they would be forced to remember what they were and what they had lost. The Tokugawa peace, for all its rigidity, was not a static era. Beneath the frozen surface of the social order, profound changes were taking place. The economy was transforming. The castle towns, where daimyo were required to maintain residences, grew into bustling cities. Edo, by the 18th century, was the largest city in the world, with a population approaching 1 million. Osaka became the nation's commercial hub, the kitchen of Japan, where rice stipends were converted into cash and merchants amassed fortunes that dwarfed those of their samurai superior. The samurai, bound by tradition and law to their hereditary stipends, watched this transformation with a mixture of disdain and envy. Disdain, because commerce was beneath them, the province of merchants they considered parasites who produced nothing themselves. Envy, because they saw the merchants growing rich while they themselves grew poorer. A samurai's stipend was fixed, based on rice production that remained constant. But the economy was monetizing, prices were rising, and the samurai's purchasing power was steadily eroding. To make ends meet, many samurai were forced to do the unthinkable. They went into debt to merchants. They pawned their heirlooms, their swords, even their armor, borrowing money at high interest rates that they could never repay. Some took up side professions, teaching in domain schools, practicing medicine, or pursuing scholarly studies. Others, in the poorer domains, quietly engaged in crafts or trades, pretending to be samurai while working with their hands, a shameful secret that could get them expelled from their class if discovered. This economic pressure created a growing gap between the ideal and the reality of samurai life. The code, the unwritten way, demanded austerity, frugality, and contempt for money. But the reality demanded survival. Samurai families, particularly in the lower ranks, struggled to feed their children, to maintain the appearance of their status, to preserve the two swords that marked them as warriors. The romantic dream of the Sengoku warrior, free and fierce and noble, became a kind of escape, a fantasy that allowed them to forget the humiliations of their daily lives. The shogunate, aware of these tensions, tried to address them through reforms. Periodically, a shogun would attempt to restore the old values, issuing sumptuary laws that restricted merchant displays of wealth, urging samurai to return to frugality, and canceling debts to relieve the pressure. These reforms were always temporary. The economic forces at work were too powerful to be stopped by decrees. The samurai were caught in a trap of their own making, a system designed for stability that was slowly strangling. And yet, even in decline, the samurai remained the ruling class. They administered justice, maintained order, and upheld the Confucian ideology that justified their position. According to this ideology, society was divided into four classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The samurai ruled because they cultivated virtue, not because they cultivated land. They were the moral exemplars, the guardians of tradition, the living embodiment of loyalty and righteousness. The farmers, who produced the rice that sustained everyone, were theoretically respected, though in practice they were heavily taxed and frequently oppressed. The artisans and merchants, who produced nothing of real value, were at the bottom, despite their wealth. This ideology, borrowed from China and adapted to Japanese conditions, gave the samurai a purpose beyond warfare. They were not just warriors, they were the conscience of the nation. A samurai who failed in his moral duties was worse than a merchant who cheated his customer. The code, once a practical guide to survival on the battlefield, had become a philosophy of life, a system of ethics that applied to every aspect of a warrior's existence. This transformation is captured in one of the most famous samurai texts, the Hagakure, or Hidden Leaves, compiled in the early 18th century by a retired samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Tsunetomo had served his lord in the domain of Saga, and after his lord's death, became a Buddhist priest. His musings on the samurai way, recorded by a younger disciple, offer a window into the warrior mind in an age of peace. The Hagakure is a radical, uncompromising text. It insists that the samurai's primary duty is to be ready to die at any moment. The way of the samurai is found in death, Tsunetomo wrote. When it comes to either or, there is only the quick choice of death. This is not a morbid obsession with dying, but a call to live with such intensity, such focus, such utter commitment to one's duty, that death becomes irrelevant. A samurai who is constantly aware of his own mortality, who has accepted that he could die at any moment, is free to act with perfect courage and perfect loyalty. Hagakure also emphasizes the importance of loyalty above all else. A retainer is one who, morning and evening, day and night, serves his lord without thought for his own affairs, forgetting his family, forgetting his own life. This is the ideal of the 47 Ronin, raised to a philosophical principle. The samurai exists only to serve. His individual desires, his personal ambition, his attachments to family and friends, all must be subordinated to the single-minded devotion to his lord. But the Hagakure also reveals the tensions and anxieties of its time. Tsunetomo wrote in reaction to what he saw as the decadence and softness of contemporary samurai. He lamented that warriors had forgotten the old ways, that they had become preoccupied with money, with comfort, with the pursuit of pleasure. His fierce, uncompromising vision was a rebuke to the samurai of his own day, a call to remember what they were supposed to be. Other texts offered a different perspective. The Budo Shishinshu, or Code of the Warrior, written by Daidoji Yuzen around the same time, is a practical manual for young samurai entering service. It covers everything from proper etiquette to military strategy, from the importance of studying history to the dangers of excessive drinking. It is less radical than the Hagakure, more concerned with the day-to-day conduct of a samurai in a peaceful society. It advises young warriors to be frugal, to be honest, to avoid gambling and bad company, and to always remember that their primary duty is to serve their lord faithfully. Together, these texts and countless others like them represent the codification of Bushidō, the way of the warrior. The unwritten way, passed down from father to son through generations of combat, was finally being written down, analyzed, and systematized. The samurai of the Tokugawa period were not just warriors. They were students of war, scholars of their own tradition, trying to preserve something that was slipping away. The preservation was itself a kind of transformation. The Bushidō of the text was not the same as the warrior ethos of the Sengoku period. It was more philosophical, more ethical, more concerned with internal cultivation than with external combat. The Sengoku samurai had been pragmatists, focused on survival and victory. The Tokugawa samurai were idealists, focused on virtue and honor. The code had become an end in itself, a standard to live up to rather than a tool to live by. This transformation was not universal. In the domains, particularly those far from the cultural centers of Edo and Kyoto, the old martial traditions remained strong. The Satsuma domain in southern Kyushu, the Choshu domain at the western tip of Honshu, the Tosa domain on the island of Shikoku, these were places where the samurai retained a fierce, independent spirit. They practiced their swordsmanship, studied military tactics, and maintained a readiness for war that seemed anachronistic in the peaceful Tokugawa world. They would prove, in the end, to be the ones who remembered what the samurai were meant to be. And in the cities, a new culture was emerging, a culture of pleasure and entertainment, of kabuki theater and ukiyo-e prints, of tea-houses and geisha districts. This was the floating world, a world of transitory delights, where merchants spent their wealth and samurai sought escape from the rigid constraints of their lives. The samurai who frequented the floating world were betraying their code, but they were also responding to a deep human need for joy, for connection, for something beyond duty. The tension between the demands of the code and the desires of the heart was becoming unbearable. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Tokugawa system began to show signs of strain. Famine struck, killing hundreds of thousands. Peasant uprisings became more frequent. The shogunate's finances, always precarious, grew desperate. Reform efforts failed. The old certainties were crumbling, and no one knew what would replace them. Then, in the summer of 1853, 4 black ships steamed into Edo Bay. Chapter 4: The Art of Peace. The Warrior in a Gilded Cave. The ships were American. They were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, and they were unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. They were steam-powered, iron-hulled, bristling with cannons that could reduce Edo to rubble. Perry had come, on behalf of President Millard Fillmore, to demand that Japan open its doors to trade and diplomacy. He made it clear that refusal would mean war. For the samurai, the sight of those black ships was a shattering revelation. For 2 centuries, they had believed their country was invulnerable, protected by the divine wind that had scattered the Mongol fleets. They had believed their warrior spirit, their Bushidō, made them superior to all other people. Now, they were confronted with a technology that made their swords and bows laughably obsolete. The foreigners had ships that moved without sails, guns that could fire from beyond the horizon. They had factories, steam engines, and a relentless expansionist energy that Japan could not match. The shogunate, paralyzed by indecision, did what it had always done. It tried to compromise. It signed treaties with Perry, opening a few ports to American ships and granting the foreigners trading rights. But the compromise satisfied no one. The emperor in Kyoto, whose ancestors had been sidelined for centuries, suddenly became a rallying point for those who opposed the shogunate's weakness. The slogan Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, swept through the samurai class like a fire. The irony was profound. The samurai who rallied to the emperor's banner were calling for a return to the old ways, for the expulsion of the foreigners who threatened Japan's sacred soil. But to achieve that goal, they would have to embrace the very things they hated: modern weapons, modern tactics, modern ideas. They would have to transform themselves, abandoning the traditions they were trying to protect. In the domains of Satsuma and Choshu, young samurai began to study Western military science. They acquired rifles, cannon, and steamships. They drilled in Western-style formations, learning to fight as part of a coordinated force rather than as individual champions. They were still samurai, still bound by the code, but they were samurai of a new kind, pragmatic, adaptable, and ruthlessly focused on a single goal: overthrowing the shogunate and restoring the emperor to power. The struggle that followed, the Bakumatsu, or end of the shogunate, was a civil war fought with modern weapons and samurai hearts. Assassinations, betrayals, and massacres marked the path to revolution. The shogunate's forces, despite their numbers, were no match for the fierce dedication and modern tactics of the imperial loyalists. In 1868, after a brief but bloody conflict known as the Boshin War, the last Tokugawa shogun resigned, and the emperor, a 15-year-old boy named Mutsuhito, was restored to nominal power. This was the Meiji Restoration, a name that suggests a peaceful return to ancient ways. In reality, it was a revolution. The new government, dominated by young samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, had no intention of returning to the past. They had seen the power of the West, and they knew that Japan must transform itself or be colonized. Their slogan was not "expel the barbarians" but "Fukoku Kyohei," rich country, strong army. The transformation they set in motion was breathtaking in its speed and scope. They abolished the domains and replaced them with prefectures, centralizing power in Tokyo, the new capital. They created a national army, conscripted from all classes, and equipped it with the latest Western weapons. They built railroads, telegraph lines, and factories. They sent students abroad to study Western science, law, and medicine. They adopted a constitution, established a parliament, and created a modern legal system. And in 1876, they did the unthinkable. They banned the wearing of swords. For the samurai, this was the final humiliation. The two swords, the daisho, were not just weapons. They were the symbol of their status, their identity, their very souls. A samurai without his swords was not a samurai. The government's decree was a declaration that the warrior class, which had ruled Japan for nearly 1,000 years, no longer existed. Some samurai accepted the new order, trading their swords for briefcases and becoming bureaucrats, businessmen, and educators. Others resisted, launching desperate rebellions that were crushed by the new imperial army. The most famous of these rebellions was led by a man who embodied the contradictions of his age, Saigo Takamori. Saigo was a samurai from Satsuma, a giant of a man with a gentle spirit and an iron will. He had been one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, a key figure in the overthrow of the shogunate. But he had grown disillusioned with the new government's policies, its rush to westernize, its neglect of the samurai class. He retired to his home in Kagoshima and established private schools where young samurai could study the traditional arts and prepare for the day when Japan would need its warriors again. That day came in 1877. The samurai of Satsuma, chafing under the new order, rose in rebellion. Saigo reluctantly agreed to lead them. He knew they could not win. The imperial army, armed with modern rifles and artillery, outnumbered and outgunned his forces. But he also knew that he could not abandon his followers, that his duty as a samurai was to stand with whatever the cost. The Satsuma Rebellion was the last stand of the samurai. For 6 months, Saigo's army fought a desperate retreat, marching north toward the castle of Kumamoto, then falling back to their homeland in the face of overwhelming imperial forces. They fought with incredible courage, their swords flashing against the massed fire of the imperial troops. But courage could not stop bullets. One by one, they fell. On September 24, 1877, the imperial army surrounded the last remnants of the rebel force on the slopes of Mount Shiroyama, overlooking the city of Kagoshima. Saigo had perhaps 300 men left, against 30,000 imperial soldiers. They had run out of ammunition. They had no hope of victory. All that remained was to die as samurai. As the sun rose, the imperial troops began their final assault. Saigo's men, armed only with swords, charged down the mountain, cutting their way into the enemy ranks. Saigo himself was hit in the femoral artery, a wound that would have killed him slowly. According to legend, he asked his comrade Beppu Shinsuke to end his suffering. Beppu, weeping, cut off Saigo's head and hid it to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The last samurai had fallen. The rebellion was over. The samurai as a class were finished. Japan had entered the modern world, and the warriors of old had no place in it. Chapter 5. The Last Stand, the Ghosts of Shiroyama. The death of Saigo Takamori was not just the end of a man or a rebellion. It was the end of an era. For nearly 1,000 years, the samurai had defined Japan. They had fought its wars, shaped its culture, and embodied its highest ideals. Now they were gone, swept away by the tide of modernity. The question that remained was not what they had been, but what they would become. what their legacy would mean for a nation hurtling toward an uncertain future. In the decades after the Meiji Restoration, the memory of the samurai was transformed. The government, having destroyed the warrior class, now needed to appropriate its spirit. The samurai became a symbol of Japanese identity, a source of national pride and unity. Their loyalty, their courage, their willingness to die for a cause, these qualities were now held up as examples for all Japanese to follow, regardless of class. The education system played a crucial role in this transformation. School children were taught the stories of legendary samurai, Yoshitsune, Masashige, the 47 Ronin. They memorized the virtues of Bushidō, loyalty, honor, courage, self-sacrifice. They learned that the spirit of the samurai lived on in the Japanese people, that it was their birthright and their duty to uphold it. The military, too, embraced the samurai legacy. The new imperial army, though equipped with modern weapons and organized along Western lines, was infused with samurai values. Officers were taught that they were the heirs of the warrior tradition, that their duty was to serve the emperor with absolute loyalty, that death in battle was the highest honor. The infamous spirit of the imperial army, which would drive Japanese soldiers to fight to the death in World War II, was a direct inheritance from the samurai code. But the transformation of the samurai into a national symbol required a selective memory. The messy, complicated reality of samurai history, the betrayals, the pragmatism, the class tensions, was smoothed over, replaced by a clean, heroic narrative. The samurai became ideals rather than people, symbols rather than historical actors. The Bushidō that was taught in schools and celebrated in popular culture was not the unwritten way of the Sengoku warrior, but a modern invention, a code of ethics designed to serve the needs of the modern state. This invented tradition reached its fullest expression in the early 20th century with the publication of Minamoto Inazo's Bushidō, the Soul of Japan. Minamoto, a Christian intellectual educated in the West, wrote his book in English. Intending to explain Japanese culture to foreign readers, he presented Bushidō as a coherent ethical system, comparable to European chivalry that had shaped Japanese character for centuries. His book was a huge success, translated into many languages, and became the standard introduction to samurai values for readers around the world. But Minamoto's Bushidō was, in many ways, a product of its time. It emphasized the virtues that the Meiji state wanted to promote: loyalty to the emperor, filial piety, self-control, and a willingness to sacrifice for the nation. It downplayed the aspects of samurai culture that were less convenient: the class prejudice, the violence, the contempt for commerce. It presented a sanitized, idealized version of the samurai that served the needs of modern Japanese nationalism. The irony is that this invented tradition became real. Japanese soldiers in World War II did, in fact, die with samurai courage. Kamikaze pilots, named after the divine wind that saved Japan from the Mongols, did sacrifice themselves for the emperor. The values that Minamoto described, however fictional their origins, shaped the behavior of millions of real people. The ghost of the samurai had become a living force in Japanese history. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the samurai legacy took another turn. The American occupation forces, determined to demilitarize Japanese society, suppressed the samurai tradition. Bushidō was associated with militarism and nationalism, with the fanaticism that had led Japan to disaster. School textbooks were rewritten. The imperial army was disbanded. The samurai once again seemed to have been consigned to history, but the samurai proved impossible to kill. In the post-war decades, as Japan rebuilt itself as an economic superpower, the samurai found a new role. They became metaphors for business success. Management consultants wrote books about applying samurai strategy to corporate competition. The samurai spirit was invoked to explain Japan's work ethic, its loyalty to companies, its dedication to quality. The warrior, who had once scorned merchants, was now celebrated as the inspiration for the businessman. This transformation, too, required a selective reading of history. The real samurai, with their contempt for commerce and their disdain for profit, would have been horrified to see themselves as models for corporate executives. But the metaphor worked because it tapped into deep currents of Japanese identity. The samurai, however transformed, remained a powerful symbol of what it meant to be Japanese. Today, the samurai live on in countless ways. They populate movies, video games, and anime. Their armor is displayed in museums. Their swords are treasured as art. Their stories are told and retold, each generation finding new meanings in the old tales. The samurai have become a global phenomenon, recognized and admired around the world. And yet the real samurai, the men who fought in the mud at Sekigahara, who plotted revenge in the shadows of Edo Castle, who charged to their deaths on the slopes of Shiroyama, remain elusive. They were not the noble philosophers of the textbooks, nor the ruthless killers of the movies. They were human beings caught in the currents of their time, struggling to live up to ideals that were often impossible to achieve. They were loyal and treacherous, brave and cowardly, selfless and ambitious. They were, in short, like us. The code they lived by, the unwritten way, was not a set of rules to be memorized, but a living tradition to be embodied. It was passed from father to son, from lord to retainer, through example and practice, not through books and lectures. It was tested in battle, in service, in the quiet moments of decision that define a life. And when the samurai themselves passed from history, they left behind not just their swords and armor, but a way of being in the world, a commitment to honor, to loyalty, to the idea that some things are worth dying for. That commitment, that spirit, is the true legacy of the samurai. It survives not in museums or textbooks, but in the hearts of those who still believe that how we live matters more than how long we live. It is the ghost that walks beside us, the whisper of the warrior in an age that has forgotten how to fight for anything beyond comfort and security. The samurai are gone, their world is dust, but their question remains, echoing down the centuries. What would you die for? And until we can answer that question, the samurai will never truly be dead.